Welcome back to the channel, everyone. I'm Robin from This Blog's Neat, and today is my sister Keri and her husband Ben's second wedding anniversary, which means that 3 or 4 years ago, I started working on a very special project for them for their wedding. I created a custom spirit for their wedding. I don't remember if it was their idea for me to do this or if I offered or anything, but shortly after they got engaged, I started working on coming up with a spirit for them. It wasn't exactly the easiest project by any means. First of all, my sister at the time did not actually enjoy spirits at all. Her go-to drink at a bar was like vodka soda or whiskey and ginger ale, and the only reason she would drink whiskey is because it paired well with ginger ale. I will say now she does drink spirits, and I like to think that the spirit that I created for her and Ben was the gateway into her enjoying all other types of spirits. So anyways, when I was questioning my sister and Ben to figure out what type of spirit I should make, I couldn't say like, what's your favorite bottle of booze? I could for Ben. He ended up giving me the name of a rye whiskey that he really enjoyed. So he was easy, my sister a little bit less so. So I had to think outside the box, and I asked them about their dessert, candle, coffee, wine preferences to try and figure out what are the flavors that they really enjoy and how can I bring those flavors into a spirit. They didn't really agree on their dessert preferences and their wine preferences, and at the time Ben didn't drink coffee. So it was really up to what kind of candles do you guys like? And they both agreed and listed sandalwood, figs, leather, and tobacco as like their main aromas that they go for. Yeah, so that's what I was aiming for. So somehow I decided to go with a rye whiskey. And I chose rye because it has a lot of rich like baking spice notes, and you can also get some fruitiness from rye. Then I started getting a little creative, and I think I was just browsing in the brew shop near me, and I thought, ooh, chocolate malted rye would be really nice. This would bring in some nice chocolatey notes. My sister's a huge fan of chocolatey desserts, and she really likes her coffees to be chocolate, toffee, caramel forward. So I thought, all right, let's use some chocolate malted rye in there. Then I also went with a little bit of Cherrywood smoked malt in the mash bill. Now, again, this was probably just something that I saw at the brew shop, smelled it, probably gave a couple nibbles, and thought like, yeah, this is really fun. I wanted to, or I hoped that this would bring forward maybe some of those sandalwood notes, like maybe a little bit more of a woody aspect, as well as some leather and some fruitiness, because Cherrywood tends to be a little bit fruitier. And then finally, the other main grain that is in the mash bill is corn. I picked some really flavorful grains, right? The rye, the chocolate malted rye, the Cherrywood smoked malt. So I thought corn would honestly be a good way to almost dilute that, so it wasn't so overpowering and grain forward. Also, corn brings a lot of sugars into the mash, and corn is pretty subtle and will leave some room for the oak to present itself, and I wanted to make sure that the oak got a chance to stand out. So instead of going with an unaged rye, I decided I wanted to oak-infuse this rye, and I wanted to go with something that would really play into those spicy, fruity characteristics and those chocolatey notes. So I chose French oak. And in order to enhance that a little bit and kind of edge off some of the like really overpowering flavors of French oak, I pre-seasoned it with Marsala wine. And this ended up working out. It was so weird. It, in theory, should not have worked out, but first mash bill pretty much worked out. First experiment pretty much worked out, and that does not happen often, so I got pretty lucky there. I did one quick small batch for R&D purposes and got the thumbs up from my sister and Ben, and continued to move forward and did a total of 6 batches. Those were 6 5-gallon batches. And in the end, I got out about 3.5 liters of booze. So 30 gallons down to just a measly, like not even a gallon of booze. Yeah, this is a lot of work, but it was worth it. And I would only do this for my sister and Ben. Mostly my sister. Ben just gets lucky because he married her, so. And here is the bottle that I kept for myself. This is the final product. Of course, the whiskey is named Maid of Honor because it was made by the Maid of Honor. So the 3.5 liters was shared among the immediate family and the bridal party. They all got to take a little bottle home with them. And on the rehearsal dinner night, I got to pour everyone, serve it for everyone, so we could cheers to my sister and Ben with their custom wedding whiskey. Now, of course, I worked on this project. I worked so hard on this project for like a year and a half. And I documented a whole lot of it and created an entire video. And now that it's their 2nd wedding anniversary, I figured it was time to share it with you guys. Now, I have edited a lot out. I will be inserting myself right here into the video to kind of bridge some gaps. But yeah, I thought it would be a cool video to share. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy my video. All right, so what I am tackling today is the fermentation for the rye whiskey that I'm going to be making for my sister Keri and her fiance Ben. They have requested a special spirit for their wedding, and based off of, you know, their flavor profile preferences, as well as their dessert preferences, coffee preferences, candle preferences, I figured a rye is where I'm gonna go. The kind of guidelines that I would follow are in the Guide to Moonshining. Although they do not recommend a mash bill that's complicated, and I've gone with a mash bill that is complicated, that I kind of just created on a whim. This will be the first iteration, so this will be take 1. I'm sure it's going to take a lot of iterations. Robin, what the heck is mashing actually doing? So the first thing that you're doing when you're mashing is you're steeping the grains in hot water. We are starting to heat up the water, gonna bring it to a boil. So what needs to happen is that the water molecules need to make their way into the grains and start to break apart those starches and release the starches, so they're not trapped in these kernels and these clusters. So I'm using 2 pounds of grains per gallon of water, so 10 pounds of grains in total. The flaked rye, our flaked maize, our Cherrywood smoked malt chocolate rye. Each grain has its own temperature where it's kind of optimal for the water to break in and bring out those starches, the amylose and the amylopectin. And for corn, it tends to be pretty high. And a lot of distillers like to say it's around when water boils. It's a little bit lower than that, but the corn starches can handle boiling water and it helps break that down faster. I tossed in 3 pounds of corn at 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And now I'm letting it sit and gelatinize for about an hour, stirring every 15 minutes. Rye is also pretty high. I think now that we're down to 170, I'm going to add in the rye. That is 4 pounds of flaked rye tossed in. So I'm gonna give this a final stir, see what the actual temperature is. If the temperature is down to about 150 to 155, I'm gonna add in 2 pounds of the Cherrywood smoked malt and 1 pound of the chocolate malted rye. Currently the mash is like a solid gelatinous mess. Very hard to stir. I know what you might be thinking. Robin, you're gonna add more grains to that? There's no water in there. But yeah, I'm gonna. Yep. Tastes like oatmeal. Now, malted barley in particular is really special because although its gelatinizing temperature is not at 155, that's actually the temperature where the enzymes that are in the malted barley are most active, the alpha and beta amylase enzymes. And you need those enzymes to now chomp, break down those starch molecules into simple sugars that the yeast can actually eat and convert into ethanol. The mash got so much thinner. How freaking amazing is that enzymatic magic that just happened? Holy guacamole. So I'm just gonna let this guy sit for a half an hour with the lid on, and then I'll come back, stir it some more. We'll check it out, see what's going on, and also give it a taste to see how much sweeter it is than when it started. And there's also a general rule of thumb for how long it takes for the alpha and beta amylase enzymes to break down the starches. It's usually around 30 minutes. I'm aiming for a little bit longer. So it's been an hour since I added in the malted rye and the malted barley, and the mash is super thin. It's great. It's also really sweet. I'm gonna cool this thing down to 95 and toss it into a fermenter and toss in my yeast. I'm going to be fermenting on grain. So I'm hoping to pull out some more flavors from the grain by doing that, because I feel that batch 2 just didn't have enough flavors. And that could be because I cooled down really quickly. Whereas for batch 1, it took like 8 hours for me to cool down. Time to cool the mash, because I didn't have my wort chiller. I really want those chocolatey flavors and cherrywood flavors to come through. So yeah, fermenting on grain seems like it should be a good deal. There were certain things that I tweaked throughout the batches. One of those was whether I fermented on grain or off grain. So for the first 2 batches 1 and 2, I fermented off grain, which means I strained out the grains before pitching the yeast and letting it ferment. For the first batch, this produced a really flavorful spirit. However, when I did the low wines distillation of the second batch, it was a little less flavorful. And the differences between those two were that the first batch, I let it cool to room temperature, essentially in my bathtub. And the second batch, I got a wort chiller. And so it cooled down a lot faster. So the amount of time that the wort was in contact with the grain was a lot shorter for batch 2 than batch 1. So for batch 3 and on, I decided I was going to ferment on grain to really maximize the flavors that I would get from the grains. So I now have my 5-gallon carboy that I sterilized upstairs in the bathtub. Now I agitate for about a minute. Here is the yeast that I use, Red Star Distillers dry yeast. And now I'm letting the yeast prime in 90-degree water before tossing it into the fermenter. We just let it sit and do its thing. I cooled it down to about 95, and then once I transferred it to the bucket, I took the specific gravity reading at 87 degrees Fahrenheit. It was 1.063 specific gravity. I then pitched 2 teaspoons of yeast. I gave it a good stir, and now here we are. So the fermentation has been going for about 5 days, and I just took the specific gravity reading. There's a lot of chocolatiness in here. You definitely get the grains, the flavor of the grains, which is good. There's a little bit of a tart cherry thing. There's a little tiny bit of fruitiness, which is probably coming from the grains as well, maybe the Cherrywood smoked malt. But yeah, so there's some good flavors. I'm interested to see how much of that chocolatiness comes through from the fermentation. It's distillation day. Once it was time to distill, I distilled each batch, the low wines, the first distillation of each batch on its own. I collected the low wines at around 30% ABV, so a nice low wines. And then I saved up those low wines and combined them all together for one single spirit distillation. So one final distillation of all, well, the first batch I did on its own, but I did the final distillation of batches 2 through 6 all together, which made my job a whole lot easier. So once I tasted all of the distillation cuts and decided which ones to keep and which ones to toss, I combined all of those. And then I added some water to bring it down to 50% ABV. This was what I decided would be my barrel entry proof, if you will, even though it's not ever going to enter a barrel. And I was skimming through my notes to try and figure out what the actual spirit cut was. But my notes are kind of all over the place and I don't really have that written down. So I'm not sure how much water I added, but I believe the spirit cut was in the mid to upper 60% ABV range. And once I had proofed it down, it was time to oak-infuse that spirit. So as I said, I use Marsala seasoned French oak. So I let the French oak staves soak in the Marsala wine for about 2 days before actually using it. And as you guys know, for my oak infusing process, sometimes I will use some heat to speed things up. And because I started this July, a month before my sister's wedding, I definitely wanted to speed things up. So I used a water bath that was sitting at around 135 degrees Fahrenheit, plus or minus 5 degrees. And I would hold the whiskey with the staves in it at that temperature for about 12-hour increments. So it would be like 12 hours on and then like 12 hours off. Once it cooled, I would taste it and repeat. And I would do that over and over and over again until the very end, when I could tell that it was starting to get closer, then those time increments were a little bit shorter.
And I am deciding if it's done or not. It's definitely astringent and a little bit tannic. The viscosity has decreased. It needs more time. So the whiskey has gotten a little bit more time, so let's taste it. The nose is nice. There's a little bit of heat on the nose though. On the palate, there's a little bit less heat. It's definitely building in viscosity, so it's got more of a creamy texture. There's some bitter chocolate there, but it still needs a little bit more time, but we're getting there. It's Monday, August 23rd, and the whiskey's done.
My sister's wedding was August 28th, by the way.
It's Monday, August 23rd.
So talk about like finishing things up at the very last moment.
So last night before bed, I gave it another taste and it had finished up. Everything tasted as I was hoping. Yeah, it needed no more aging. It came out to be about 3.5 liters at 50% ABV. What's in your bottle is cask strength, so that's what I matured it at. So let's give it a taste, shall we? So right away I get spices. This is more like anise and lots of cinnamon. The cinnamon is almost like the cinnamon pine cones that are at Trader Joe's during winter. There's some dark dried fruit and of course some chocolate, like malted milk ball chocolate though. The nose is sweet and has a little bit of like a brown butter thing to it. I'm getting some burnt caramel. There's a little bit of heat initially, but this is at 50% ABV. So that is to be expected. But the heat gives way and starts to build up this creamy mouthfeel. Immediately, the chocolate is up front, very present. It's like Tootsie Rolls as well as bitter chocolate. And there's a lot of spice in the finish. So again, that cinnamon's coming through. Maybe this is more of like a cinnamon bark. That burnt caramel's coming through. It's got a long, sweet finish. I hope you guys enjoy it. And I hope every time you appreciate the whiskey in your glass, you think fondly of my sister and Ben, because this was made exclusively with them in mind.
So as I mentioned, this was a very challenging, although very rewarding project to work on, and I would not have done it for anyone else. And would I have like done things differently if I were to do it again? Probably not. Somehow this worked out really well. It checked all of the boxes that I was going for. It worked out really well. Now, before I go, I want to give a huge shout out to the Patreons. Thank you guys so much for helping to support the channel. And speaking of supporting the channel, if you, the viewer, enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments if you have any questions at all about the whiskey making process. If anything I mentioned was unclear at all, please just let me know. And if you want to support the channel even further, you can join us over on Patreon. I've got a link in the description below. And with that, cheers to my sister and Ben. Happy wedding anniversary. This is their wedding logo, by the way, on these little mini Glencairns.